If you are here right now, watching this video, it is not by accident. Something inside you was already searching for this message. Maybe you have started to feel that reality is not as fixed as it seems. That your thoughts, your imagination, and your inner world may have more power than you were ever taught to believe. Genevieve Behrend believed that imagination is not just fantasy, it is a force. A hidden power shaping the reality you experience every single day. Most people never realize this. They allow the outer world to control their minds, without understanding that the mind itself may be creating the outer world. And once you understand this hidden force, you may never see reality the same way again. What if the life you are living right now is not the result of your circumstances, but the exact mirror of your most persistent thoughts? What if the universe has been listening to you, not to your words, but to the invisible frequency of your imagination, and faithfully building a reality to match it? These are not modern ideas. They are not trends. They are ancient truths that were rediscovered, refined, and lived, truly lived, by one of the most remarkable women of the early 20th century, Genevieve Behrend, the only personal student of Thomas Troward, the judge whose mental science teachings would quietly influence figures like Napoleon Hill, William Atkinson, and even the roots of what we now call the law of attraction. Genevieve Behrend did not merely study these principles. She demonstrated them. She used the power of imagination to manifest an extraordinary sum of money against all odds, crossed the Atlantic alone to find her teacher, and spent decades teaching others how to awaken the silent architect that dwells within every human mind. Tonight, we enter her world. We walk through the architecture of her thought. We will not skim the surface. We are going to go deep, chapter by chapter, into the hidden mechanics of how imagination shapes reality, how thought becomes matter, and how you, starting from this very moment, can begin using the greatest force you were born with. If this is the kind of content that speaks to you, the intersection of mysticism, mental science, and real transformation, then before we go any further, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. New teachings go up every week. This is a community for those who are done being asleep. Now let us begin. The silent architect, what imagination really is. Most people believe imagination is a kind of escape, a daydream, a flight of fancy indulged by children and artists and those who have not yet faced the hardness of reality. Genevieve Behrend would tell you this is among the most dangerous misunderstandings a human being can carry, because imagination is not an escape from reality. Imagination is the factory where reality is made. To understand what Behrend taught, we must first clear the fog around this word. Imagination, in her framework, and in the framework of her teacher Thomas Troward, is not mere fantasy. It is the supreme activity of the mind, operating at its highest frequency. It is the capacity of consciousness to form a mental image so vivid, so emotionally charged, so repeatedly held, that it begins to attract the physical conditions necessary for its manifestation in the outer world. Troward taught, and Behrend lived, that the universe is fundamentally mental in nature, that beneath the visible layer of matter, energy, circumstance, and event, there is an intelligent medium, an infinite, formless substance, that responds to the shape of thought impressed upon it. He called it the universal mind. Others have called it source, the infinite, the subconscious of the cosmos. The name matters less than the principle. This medium is not passive. It is responsive. And the primary language through which it receives instruction is the language of mental imagery held in feeling. Here is what makes Behrend's approach different from vague optimism or wishful thinking. She was not teaching people to simply want things. She was teaching them to internally become the version of themselves that already possesses what they desire. There is a critical difference. Wanting places the desired thing outside of you. Imagining, truly imagining in the Behrend sense, brings the reality of that thing inside you first, so that the outer world must rearrange itself to match. She wrote in her masterwork, Your Invisible Power, that the image you hold in your mind is the mold into which the universal substance is poured. The clearer and more persistent the image, the more precisely the substance takes its shape. Think of a sculptor. The clay does not resist the sculptor's vision. It yields to it. Completely. The universal substance, according to Behrend, yields to imagination with the same totality. Not sometimes, not when conditions are favorable, but always, without exception, as an immutable law of mind. Now consider the weight of that. If imagination always impresses itself upon the responsive substance of the universe, then every person is already using this power. Every moment. The question is not whether you are using the force of imagination. The question is what you are using it to build. Most people, through unconscious habit, through fear, through the constant rehearsal of what they lack and what they dread, are using this infinite creative power to manufacture more of what they do not want. They are sculptors who keep pressing worried, contracted, fearful images into the clay, and then look at the result with horror, never understanding why their world looks the way it does. Behrend herself was a woman of deep courage and precision. When she first encountered Troward's teachings, she was living a comfortable but spiritually empty life. Something in the work cracked her open. She resolved, with full deliberateness, to use the very principles she was studying to fund a trip to Edinburgh to study under Troward personally, despite having no visible means to do so. She did not beg. She did not strategize endlessly. She built an image. She held it. She felt it. And the money appeared, in a manner she had not foreseen and could not have engineered by logic alone. That story is not a miracle. That story is a demonstration. A living proof that the principles she was teaching were not philosophy, they were mechanics. Reliable, repeatable, universal mechanics. And this is where Chapter 1 leaves us standing at a threshold. Because once you accept that imagination is not decoration but architecture, once you feel in your body that your mental imagery is not passive but causative, a question begins to rise in you with urgency. If this is real, if this is law, then how does it actually work? What is the precise inner mechanism by which thought becomes thing? That is exactly where we are going next. The law behind the veil, how thought becomes matter. If imagination is the architect, then the universal law of mind is the ground on which it builds. And Genevieve Behrend spent her entire teaching life making this law accessible, not as abstract metaphysics, but as something a person could feel in their chest, grasp in their hands, and apply before the end of the day. The foundational principle she worked from, drawing directly from Troward, is this. The subjective mind, the deeper layer of your own consciousness, is in direct and unbroken communication with the universal mind. And the universal mind is the source of all form, all energy, all circumstance. What passes between your personal subjective mind and the universal mind is not words. It is not desire statements. It is the vibrational quality of your most dominant mental images combined with the emotional state those images generate. Let us be precise here, because precision matters enormously in this work. Behrend was not teaching a casual, soft, feel-good philosophy. She was teaching mental engineering. And in engineering, sloppiness produces poor results. In the mechanics of mental manifestation, there are three elements that must work in concert. The first is clarity of image. The mental picture you hold must be definite, not vague, not shifting, not half-formed out of uncertainty. The universal substance, she taught, does not know how to respond to blur. It responds to definition. If you imagine abundance but your mental image is foggy, a general sense of having more, the result is a foggy, indefinite outer condition. But if your image is clear, specific, and architecturally complete in your mind's eye, the responsive medium has precise instructions to work with. The second element is emotional conviction. The image alone is a blueprint. But a blueprint without the force of feeling behind it is inert paper. Emotion is the energy that charges the image. It is what moves the universal substance from neutrality to motion. Behrend taught that you must feel the reality of your image as though it already exists, not as a performance, not as an affirmation repeated without inner resonance, but as a genuine, embodied recognition that what you are seeing in your mind is as real as what you are seeing with your eyes. This is where most people fail. They produce the image but collapse at the feeling. They cannot sustain the emotion of possession because some deeper layer of them believes the thing is not truly theirs. The third element, and this is perhaps the most mystical of the three, is surrender. Once the image has been clearly formed and emotionally charged, Behrend taught that the practitioner must release it to the universal mind with full trust. Not passive resignation, not anxious waiting, but the calm, settled certainty of someone who has placed a seed in fertile soil and knows that the intelligence of nature will do the rest. Interference, constant checking, doubting, redesigning out of fear, is the surest way to strangle the process. The gardener who digs up a seed every day to check its progress does not get a harvest. This three-part mechanics explains something Behrend often addressed: why some people try these principles and fail. Almost always, the failure is in one of these three places. The image is vague, the emotion is forced or absent, or the surrender becomes anxiety in disguise, a tense watching of the horizon that carries in it the vibration of doubt. And doubt, she insisted, is not the opposite of faith in some moral sense. It is simply a different mental image, the image of the thing not happening, which the responsive medium receives and acts upon with the same faithfulness. Here is the mystic depth of this teaching. The universe does not judge. It does not select winners. It does not have favorites. It is impersonal, as Behrend and Troward both insisted, in the most profound sense. It responds with perfect, mechanical accuracy to whatever image is most persistently and emotionally held in consciousness. This means the person who suffers is not being punished. The person who thrives is not being rewarded. Both are demonstrating the same law from different sides. The law itself is the most democratic force in existence. It serves everyone with absolute equality. Behrend's own journey continued to deepen after she studied with Troward. She spent years lecturing across America, teaching this material to thousands of people. And again, the stories came back to her, of healings, of financial reversals, of relationships transformed, not through manipulation of the outer world, but through disciplined transformation of the inner image. But there is a layer beneath even this. A deeper question that Behrend herself grappled with. If the law is impersonal, if imagination is the supreme power, why do so few people master it? Why does the human being, given access to this infinite creative force, so consistently misuse it, or never access it at all? The answer to that question reaches into the most mysterious territory of her teaching. And it begins with an understanding of the invisible prison that most minds never know they are living in. We cross that threshold next. The invisible prison, breaking the patterns that block your power. Genevieve Behrend understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to articulate in its own language. The greatest obstacle to using the creative power of imagination is not a lack of knowledge. It is not a lack of will. It is the presence of a deeply embedded counterimage. An invisible architecture of belief so familiar, so habitual, so woven into the fabric of daily experience, that most people never even recognize it as a construction. They experience it as reality itself. She called this the fixed belief of limitation. Troward called it inverted thinking. Today we might call it a scarcity paradigm or a negative core belief. But regardless of the name, the phenomenon is the same. A mental image of the self as fundamentally limited, unworthy, incapable, or excluded from the abundance that the universal mind holds available for all without exception. This counter-image does not announce itself. It does not walk in through the front door of consciousness with a name tag. It lives in the background, in the low hum of daily thought, in the reflex of fear when a new opportunity appears, in the habitual rehearsal of past failures, in the almost automatic assumption that things will not work out, that resources are scarce, that safety requires smallness. These are not just thoughts. In the framework Behrend taught, they are active mental images, constantly impressed upon the responsive universal substance, constantly generating conditions that confirm themselves. This is the cruel elegance of the invisible prison. It is self-validating. The person who carries the deep image of scarcity generates scarcity. That scarcity appears to prove the image correct. The image deepens. More scarcity is generated. The cycle tightens, and what began as an impressed belief becomes an apparently objective fact about the nature of reality. Breaking this cycle requires more than positive thinking layered over a negative foundation. Behrend was very clear about this. Surface optimism pasted over deep fear is like whitewash on a rotting wall. It does not address the structure. What she taught instead was a process of going beneath, of reaching into the subjective mind and replacing the root image rather than decorating the surface. This required, first, honest recognition. The practitioner must be willing to look clearly at what they are actually imaging, not what they wish they were imaging, not their ideal self-concept, but the real, felt, emotionally charged picture they carry of themselves and their possibilities. This kind of honesty is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of genuine freedom. The second step was deliberate substitution. Not suppression of the old image. Suppression merely drives it deeper where it continues to operate invisibly, but consistent, patient, emotionally engaged replacement. Every time the old image arose, Behrend taught her students to greet it without resistance and immediately replace it with the new, chosen image. Not in desperation, not in combat, but with the calm authority of someone who knows they are the thinker, not the thought. The mind, she insisted, cannot hold two opposing images with equal emotional intensity at the same time. Whichever image receives the greater emotional investment will dominate, and the dominating image will produce its outer equivalent. There is something deeply mystical in this teaching that goes beyond technique. Behrend spoke of the moment when a practitioner, through sustained inner work, first genuinely shifts their sense of identity, when they move from experiencing themselves as a limited person trying to attract good things from outside, to experiencing themselves as an individualized expression of the universal mind, from which all good naturally flows. She described this shift as the pivotal awakening, the moment when the invisible prison dissolves, not because the bars were broken, but because the self that believed itself imprisoned suddenly recognized it was never bound. This is not a metaphor. In her framework, it is a literal restructuring of the relationship between the individual consciousness and the universal mind. Once a person genuinely knows, not intellectually accepts but feels in the marrow of being, that they are an expression of the infinite creative intelligence, the entire posture of their imagination changes. They no longer imagine from a place of lack trying to reach sufficiency. They imagine from a place of wholeness, already complete, giving form to what is already theirs by nature. Behrend lived this. She taught this. And she watched it transform lives across decades of work. But there was still one more layer, one final and extraordinary dimension of her teaching that many students of this material overlook entirely. It concerns not the power of imagination over external circumstances alone, but its power over something far more intimate, the body, the health, and the living tissue of physical life itself. This is where her teaching reaches its most astonishing territory, and we are going there now. The body obeys, healing, wholeness, and the final secret of imagination. Of all the dimensions of Genevieve Behrend's teaching, none is more startling, or more carefully grounded in principle, than her work on the relationship between imagination and the physical body. Because Behrend did not treat health as a separate category from abundance, or from outer circumstances, or from any other area of life. She saw the body as precisely what Troward had described it, a projection of the subjective mind into physical form. And if the subjective mind projects outward into circumstances, it projects inward, or rather downward into density, into the cells, the organs, the living systems of the human body. This means, in her framework, that chronic patterns of fear, grief, resentment, or self-image of weakness do not merely affect mood. They actively impress themselves upon the physical substrate of the body, and the body, being a faithful instrument of the mind, expresses those impressions as symptom, as disease, as deterioration. This was not mystical speculation for Behrend. It was the logical extension of the same law she had already demonstrated in the realm of money and circumstance. If the universal mind responds to imagination without exception, then the body, as the closest and most intimate aspect of the manifest world, must respond first and most directly. The healing implications of this are enormous. Behrend taught that the practitioner who seeks physical well-being must approach the body the same way a sculptor approaches clay, with a clear and lovingly held mental image of wholeness. Not focusing upon the disease. Not rehearsing the symptoms. Not feeding the condition with anxious attention, which, in her mechanics, is the equivalent of watering a weed and calling it gardening, but holding, with emotional conviction and sustained focus, the image of the body in its natural state of perfect health and vital function. She spoke of the body's intelligence, what she understood as the expression of universal mind operating at the cellular level, as a fundamentally cooperative force. The body wants to return to balance. The body's natural trajectory, left unobstructed by contrary mental imagery, is toward health, regeneration, and wholeness. Disease, from this perspective, is not the body's failure. It is the body's faithful response to a persistent contrary image held in the subjective mind. Remove the image, replace it with the image of wholeness, and you remove the instruction that was producing the condition. This is extraordinary teaching. And Behrend was careful about how she framed it, never denying the reality of physical experience, never dismissing the suffering of illness, but always redirecting attention to the causative level, the level of mind, where genuine change originates. She had seen too many demonstrations to doubt it. People who had been told their conditions were permanent had, through sustained inner work and the disciplined application of imaginative power, experienced reversals that their physicians could not explain by any other logic. But here is where she issued her deepest warning, and her most profound invitation simultaneously. The practitioner who uses these principles only when in crisis, only when circumstances become desperate enough to force a turn inward, is like a musician who only picks up their instrument when the house is on fire. The full power of imagination is not an emergency tool. It is a way of life. A daily, moment-by-moment orientation of the inner life toward wholeness, abundance, love, and the recognition of the infinite creative power that operates through every human consciousness without exception. Behrend's final and most intimate teaching was this: you are not a person trying to access a power outside yourself. You are the power, individualized. You are the universal mind, localized in this body, in this moment, in this particular life. And your imagination is not a trick you are playing on reality. It is reality's own creative intelligence, operating through you, as you, waiting only for your conscious participation. When you imagine deliberately, when you choose your mental images with care, charge them with the emotion of genuine belief, and release them with the calm confidence of someone who knows the law is always working, you are not asking the universe for something. You are the universe, forming itself anew through the highest faculty of your being. That is the hidden force of imagination. That is why reality obeys thought. Not because thought magically compels an external world, but because there is no true separation between the thinker and the world being thought. There is only the one creative intelligence, endlessly exploring its own infinite possibility through the medium of individual consciousness, and you, right now, are one of those instruments of exploration. Genevieve Behrend gave her life to this truth. She lived it, taught it, demonstrated it, and left it encoded in her words for those who were ready to receive it. Tonight, you have received it. What you do with it, beginning now, beginning with the very next thought you allow yourself to think, is entirely and gloriously yours. The door is already open, now walk through it. We have traveled far together tonight. From the first silence of the hook to the living architecture of Chapter 1, where we discovered that imagination is not decoration but the very factory of reality. Through Chapter 2, where we uncovered the precise mechanics by which thought becomes matter, the three-part law of clarity, emotion, and surrender. Into Chapter 3, where we faced the invisible prison of the counter-image, the self-validating cycle of limitation, and the extraordinary possibility of dissolving it not by force but by recognition. And finally into Chapter 4, where we arrived at the most intimate truth of all, that the body itself obeys the mind, that health is not separate from thought, and that you are not a person reaching for a power outside yourself. You are the power, conscious of itself. Genevieve Behrend lived in a time when these ideas were considered radical. When a woman traveling alone across the Atlantic to sit at the feet of a philosopher was itself an act of imagination made flesh. She did not have a platform. She did not have an audience waiting for her. She had only the absolute, unshakable certainty that the law was real, and the willingness to stake her life on it. And the universe, as it always does, met her certainty with proof. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it too quickly. What is the image you have been carrying of yourself? Not the image you show the world. Not the one you rehearse in hopeful moments, but the one that lives in the background, the quiet hum beneath your daily thought. The image that arises automatically when a new opportunity appears, when something beautiful seems possible but just out of reach, when you lie awake at 3 in the morning and the mind goes to its most honest places. What does that image look like? What does it feel like? Because that image, that precise, emotionally charged, habitually held picture of yourself and your possibilities, is what the universal substance has been receiving as its instruction. Always. Without pause. This is not said to create guilt. Guilt is itself a limiting image and it accomplishes nothing. This is said to create awareness. Because awareness is the beginning of everything. The moment you can see the image you have been holding unconsciously is the moment you gain the power to choose a different one. And choice, conscious, deliberate, emotionally invested choice of the image you will henceforth hold, is the whole of the practice that Genevieve Behrend spent her life teaching. You do not need to change your circumstances first. You do not need to wait until the evidence appears. You do not need permission from the outer world to begin imagining differently. In fact, waiting for outer circumstances to change before changing the inner image is precisely backwards. It is trying to change the reflection without moving in front of a different mirror. The inner shift comes first. Always. Without exception. And the outer world, obedient, faithful, impersonal, follows. So here is what I want to leave you with. Not a technique. Not a formula. Something simpler and far more powerful than either. Tonight, before you sleep, find 5 quiet minutes. Close your eyes. And build one image. One clear, specific, emotionally alive image of something you desire. Not the wanting of it. The having of it. The being the person for whom this is already real. Feel it in your chest. Let it be warm and certain and unhurried. Hold it for as long as it stays vivid and alive. Then release it, not in doubt, but in trust, the way you release a breath, knowing the body will breathe again without your management. Do this not once. Do this every day. Do this until the image is more familiar than the old story. Do this until the internal reality of what you are imagining begins to feel more true than the external evidence of what has not yet changed. Because that is the threshold. That is the crossing point. And on the other side of that crossing is what Behrend spent her life pointing toward, a life lived from the inside out. A life in which you are no longer the passive receiver of whatever the world happens to deliver, but the conscious, deliberate, awake creator of the reality you choose to inhabit. You were brought here for a reason. The part of you that knows this was already awake before you pressed play. Honor that part. Feed it. Return to it. And if this video planted even one seed of genuine recognition in you, share it with someone who is also searching. Because the world has enough people living in the invisible prison. What it needs is more people who have found the door. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this seriously. And I will see you in the next one.